Greetings! Welcome to Terra Prime Live. Darth Anonymous coming to you from Terra Prime headquarters. Today we are going to be entering the Sword Lab. If you've been following us for any length of time, you'll probably have realized that we have a kind of ulterior motive to this whole lightsaber gig. And that's to kind of raise interest and raise awareness and get people interested in actual martial arts, especially weapons-based martial arts like historical European martial arts or Asian martial arts, kendo, all that kind of stuff, fencing. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about actual swords, steel, the things that we really love. That's how we came to this spot. We love the lightsabers. We obviously we've made a career out of it, but we really came from the sword, and the lightsaber really owes most of its existence to the sword. So we're going to be talking about that. Joining me here on the panel, we've got a few of our learners in exile, and both knights and apprentices and masters. We've got Master Nero here. How you doing, Nero?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Very good. You're a little bit incognito, but that's okay.
Yeah, I'm working to fix that.
All right. And then one of our knights from the program, Jeff Macklin. How you doing, Jeff?
Good. How's everybody else doing?
Excellent. All right. And then one of our apprentices, Robert, and Orinthius is his character name. So how you doing there?
I'm well, Master. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, so let's get to it. So many of you tuning in will probably already know some of this information because we're going to go over some basics and all that kind of stuff, because we're kind of really going to the people who are new to the whole weapons gig. Maybe this is the first time you've ever picked up a weapons, picking up a lightsaber. Maybe you're just kind of fooling around at home and you bought an Ultra Saber and you want to kind of learn how to move it around, and you kind of sparked some interest. We've had some people in the LX program on the forum on Facebook. If you want to check that out, we'll put a link in the bottom. That people have asked some advice on picking out new, real swords to practice with and all that kind of thing. And so we're going to talk about that today. So we come from a bunch of different backgrounds. So hopefully we'll pretty much have the gamut covered. Anything that is missing, or please comment, and definitely try to put some sort of link in there, or maybe revisit the topic at some point. So I think probably the best place to start is just to go over with kind of the anatomy of a sword. And for that, I will pick a very familiar kind of looking object to us, a kind of Western, long, swordy, knight, Robin Hood type of looking sword here. Okay, so this is something that we all see a lot. We see it in the movies and all that kind of stuff. And so this is a pretty good example of what we're going to hear. So obviously we have our blade right here. Now the blade is divided into different pieces depending on what school of swordsmanship you belong to, and how they view the blade. We'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially you've got two main bits to the blade. You've got a flat and you got an edge. The flat can be doesn't have to be flat, can be of many different shapes and stuff like that, but the edge is obviously coming down into a sharp edge. We'll go into if it's sharp or not in a second. We can generally say that swords should be sharp, but a lot of times they're not as sharp as most people think. Now down here, the other part, the handle, this whole assembly we call the hilt. And that's what we, in lightsabers, we call that the business bit, that we have all the greaves on and the switches. For a regular sword, we don't really have a whole lot on it. We have a grip, right, handle here, called different stuff again. We have this, which is essentially called a pommel, pommel nut or whatever. We have a cross guard or a hand guard, and that essentially is it. It's a very simple object, very simple machine. Now you're going to notice right here, as far as blade geometry goes, we'll go into some different geometries here in a second. I've got my steel lined up here. But you'll notice this little divot right here. Okay, this is called a fuller, and a lot of times it's called a blood groove, and not really. People say that it's there to stop, your sword from getting stuck in somebody and everything like that. And there's lots of arguments for and against it. The real reason that they started putting fullers in there is it's to lighten the blade, to change its balance and stuff like that, and maintain its strength, very much like an IB. It's not to say that blade geometry does not come into play when we're talking about the efficiency of cutting weapons, and again, we'll get into that here. But the blood groove isn't going to give you an advantage one way or the other, taking something out of a body. It is true, though, that when you stab somebody, if you stab somebody through, all of the tissues and muscles and everything like that tend to contract around it and will tend to grip the thing. And then, of course, just the friction of the steel. But so that's kind of what we're dealing with. Now, if we go into other swords, we can see the same things happening. We'll go to another very common sword, and then, Jeff, I know you probably have better examples of this kind of stuff, but this is a fine example. Just a katana, Japanese-style sword. Again, we've got our handle, we've got our pommel, we've got our handguard, we've got our blade. Okay. Now the blade here is curved. Okay, and you'll notice that we've got swords of different size, different shapes, right? Curved blades generally are cutting weapons, and that's going to come in with balance as well. So a katana is primarily a cutting weapon. So the curve really kind of drives the efficiency of a cutting motion through the physics and logistics of it all. But it still has the same kind of pieces. So you've got your blade, you have your handle, and all of that. So no matter kind of what the form that all of these things are taking, we're going to be talking about the same essential kind of pieces to it. Now, some things, these are both, I think I used just two-handed weapons. You also, of course, have one-handed weapons like this. And this is, since it is curved, it's going to be a little bit more cutting in that respect. So, so that's kind of like a little introduction to just bits of the sword. Blade, handguard, handle, pommel. These basic things are really common to all hilt weapons and such things like that. And that's essentially what the definition is, a hilt weapon. So yeah. Anybody got anything to add to that? Jeff, or do you have examples? Or?
No, well, I've got a couple of kind of interesting Japanese weapons if we want to go into kind of the details of some of these things. You kind of showed just a real basic katana. I have a couple that are kind of neat. This one is it's called a ko katana. It's kind of a small version. It's a wagazashi length blade with a full length handle on it. So it actually allows for very rapid movement in a very short distance. As you can see, the distance on the length of this is very small. It's roughly the length of my arm.
Huh.
Yeah, so it's a really, really fast weapon, but obviously you're sacrificing reach for a lighter, smaller weapon. Now, the other one I've got is actually a real ninja sword. You see a lot of the ninja swords are straight. Those didn't exist. Those are purely American-made in movies. The ninja back in samurai times in feudal Japan were basically just spec ops warriors. They were just specially trained samurai. They were just like all the other guys. They just had special weapons and were trained a little differently. So this is actually a ninja katana. It's what the ninjutsu would use, which ninjutsu is basically one school of their training. But it's a very long handle. It's about a 17-inch handle. And the blade, I'll show you here, the blade itself is not the same length as its scabbard. You can see the difference. I'm not sure if the camera's picking that up really well. But the blade is about 4 to 5 inches shorter than the actual, than its actual saya, or its scabbard. so that it looked like a long blade when worn on the belt, but truth be told, it could be drawn very quickly and in a very, very tight quarters. But these weapons were made to be able to be used either in this long gripped form, or you could slide back and use it like a standard katana, which would gain you an extra couple of inches on the blade. So these are just kind of like nifty different versions of the standard katana. Also, just a weird little factoid, the katana was really only sharpened out to about this position here, which they called the monouchi. It's just, that's obviously in a curved saber type of blade. That's the fastest part of the blade when it's moving. It's going to be this last little bit here. So that's the part you wanted to hit with whenever you struck with the blade. So they would really only keep this part sharpened. Now, the ninja were, like, depending on the school, the types that they did, they would actually allow this part to get nice and jagged and rusted, and they would use it as a weapon too, kind of like a saw blade sometimes. They'd use it kind of nasty. They'd leave it nasty. They wanted bacteria to grow on it. They were kind of weird like that. But most samurai would just kind of take out any edges, but they didn't leave a razor edge on this part. You see a lot of it in the movies where they drag the sword across the stomach of somebody and the guy falls over. This part could start a cut, but it necessarily couldn't complete it. The end of it out here was the very, very sharp part. So you could drag the blade completely across somebody, but it really wouldn't begin to cut until it got out to this portion here. We'll get into later when we talk about like opposition and the way that you receive a parry and things like that. But you typically didn't want to strike these blades edge on because they were so hard and brittle on the edges, and they were typically softer on the back and sides. So that's the big difference between the Japanese sword and the English long swords and a lot of the straight-bladed weapons at the time.
Yeah, we're going to get into that when we get into balance and the parrying and the use of all of those little pieces. Jared, you got any examples of stuff you got laying around or anything?
Well, I actually do. I brought a few here just for this show. I mean, we don't have to show them off now, but I will bring out this because it reminded me of something Jeff was saying about the quick draw and the close quarters and everything. This is probably my favorite, actually. It's my side sword. It's a Hanwei. It's nice, but not, overly ornamental, just kind of a guard, very much like a rapier. But these were sort of almost like a hybrid weapon in between the longer rapier that was used for dueling and that kind of thing, and stabbing primarily. These are a bit shorter. I don't know if you can see. I mean, I'm kind of tall, so take this with a grain of salt. But it's really not very long in proportion. You look at the blade and everything. And the actual blade itself starts off rather thick. Well, not thick, I mean wide. But the point is that it's kind of a hybrid weapon. It's not long and thin like the rapier, so it's not specifically intended for stabbing, but rather sort of a versatile weapon that could be used by city guards and everything like that at the time for close quarters, brawls that happen indoors, and that hence the versatility of being able to stab or cut. It has a ricasso for fine blade control, or it could be used for cutting, because it has a little bit of a sturdier blade for that purpose. So kind of the same idea in terms of like you can use this in any situation because you need to be able to react to anything kind of concept.
And actually, that's a good segue because that would be what we consider a cut and thrust weapon, something that's kind of suited for both cutting and thrusting, and that's where we'll get into kind of like, we'll just transition here into the different types of swords specifically. And in my system of sword, that the Chinese, that's kind of it's a bunch of systems all kind of put together, but we separate them in kind of like different shapes, right? So you have your long, your straight, your thrusting weapons, primarily thrusting weapons. This goes for swords like jian in Chinese, or long swords, rapiers, stuff like that, spears. Anything that's really meant to really thrust in there is kind of one category. And then you've got cutting weapons, which are meant to slash and chop and cut through there. And then you have the kind of blunt force trauma, which need to be swung and get lots of force behind them. So if you want, so we'll talk about there now. Interestingly enough, if you look historically at the development of weapons, the first type of sword that was invented was a straight sword, a double-edged straight sword. It was essentially a sharpened club, and most of the old swords are just essentially a handle with this big, huge thing. Now, in certain cultures, they kind of stumbled upon the fact that if you thicken one edge, and you notice that you cut better with one edge. If we use this sword here, I notice that I cut better when I'm coming down like this than I do with this edge, right? So I also notice that the more weight there is in the blade, the better it cuts. Okay, so like in the case of Chinese swords, very early on they discovered that if you just don't sharpen this edge and thicken it up to make a very large, straight razor, essentially, you've improved that kind of cutting tool. And as such, the straight sword, double-edged sword, went out of military use very, very early on, essentially Tang Dynasty-ish. And it became a civilian weapon and very quickly became relegated to a ceremonial type of thing, so, that kind of thing. It was almost completely replaced by the single-edged cutting dao, where the Japanese thing goes. And so if we look at a Jin, this is just the Chinese version here. So this is the double-edged straight sword. It's styled very kind of recently, Qing Dynasty, that type of thing. You'll notice that it has a very kind of insubstantial guard. That's something that's always been a kind of feature of the straight swords. There are some examples that are larger, but most of the time they're about like this, about the length of a schild on a practiced long German longsword. Now they don't have a whole lot of long swords because they switched over to sabers and spears very, very early on. So there aren't a whole lot of examples of that. But so they kind of favored the cutting weapon, and to transition kind of into that, we've got the Chinese version of the Nodachi, the field sword. This is the double-handed saber, or sometimes called the dandao, which is just the single saber, meaning you can only wield one of them. It's, as you see, very, very long. It was used very much like a claymore, like a long sort of great sword in Europe, or the Nodachi in Japanese. So it's a battlefield weapon. It's going to be used primarily against other long weapons like swords and spears and halberds. It was kept sharp. I believe, I haven't examined any historical examples, but I believe it was kept sharp through most of the blade. It had more of an axe-ish chisel type edge than it did a razor edge. So you're really looking more for boom, and that's going to be one of the major features of a cutting weapon versus a thrusting weapon, is where it balances. And you can see here it balances fairly far away from the guard here, and that's what gives it blade presence. It feels heavy because it's dropping down like this. Now, a lot of people, when they pick up a lightsaber for the first time, they try to get it to balance right here at the hand because that feels so nice. And we can debate the reality of it if it were a real lightsaber or whatever, but for the techniques and stuff like that, and biomechanics and all of that kind of thing, when we're talking about real swords, you're going to be talking with a balance point that's in front of your hand most of the time. Now, the more you want to thrust and have point control, the closer that balance point is going to get to the guard. But that's not to say that there's any one place that a sword is going to balance, okay? Cutting weapons are going to tend to balance further away because they're going to give you more blade presence, they're going to give you more mechanical advantage in your cuts. Boom. You want to be able to kind of just pick it up and let it fall, and just the physics of it falling be able to go through something. That would be ideal. And there are many examples of stuff like that. If we look at a recent weapon in the Chinese arsenal, which I brought out a couple of times, the Dadao, which was used in the pre-Republican era. This is a very heavy cutting weapon, right? Not very heavy. It's like about 3 pounds. You know, it also balances pretty far from the guard out here. But the idea is that you're chopping. It's a close quarters thing, so it's very short, right? Just like your katana there, or the cut and thrust, right? So what we're doing is, what they would do is it was kind of trench warfare. They'd be holding lines and firing, and when they would get into bayonet range, the Chinese troops would take this out, and they were so affected with this thing, where they could just essentially, as the bayonet or spear attack was coming in, you can parry it up like this, and then immediately just bring it down. These things are so heavy and so weighted to the front, right? It takes that's why it's two-handed, even though it's so short, right? Because it's a very, very powerful cutting weapon. You can just go boom, and it's like an axe. It just goes right through something. And so that's a pretty good characteristic of cut versus a thrust weapon. Now, anybody can do anything with any weapon. I mean, that's not... If you want to thrust with the Dada, go right ahead. It's probably not the most efficient thing to do, but you can. These, a little bit different because it's a slashing weapon, but I do actually want a bit of tip control with this guy, right? So it's probably closer than most Dao, which is probably, where is it? There. About here. Okay, most Dao probably about there. Right? So it's going to be more maneuverable that way, because I still want that kind of tip control there. So that would be the basic balance point. So there's no real right balance point. It's just where you like it. Balance point closer to the hilt is going to give you more tip control. Balance point further away from the hilt is going to give you more cutting power. You decide which one of these. You know, it's always a trade-off with anything in nature. So yeah. Anything to add, guys?
The only thing I'll say is, to kind of piggyback onto that is what I typically do. My main style of Japanese swordsmanship is iajitsu, or iedo, which is the drawing of the blade. So typically, those are the blades that they're going to have that they're going to have the fuller in it, or the blood groove, whatever people want to call it. But what that does is it also balances the blade more towards the front of the weapon, so that this is balanced about 1.5 inches away from the actual guard. But it's made so that it can be drawn quickly, and it's not too blade heavy, so that it can still be maneuvered with one hand, and then you could still use it with two hands. But a lot of the iajitsu weapons will have the fuller in them, just so that you can draw them faster than weapons that aren't. Now, I've got one behind me, all beat up, that does not have the blood groove in it. It does not have the fuller. It's just a straight katana edge, and it balances about 4 inches away from the handle. So it's very, very blade heavy, but it's also much easier to cut with. So you kind of, at least with Japanese swords, that's what they traded off. They would trade off cutting power and ease of, ease of kind of follow through for the quickness of a draw.
Yeah, yeah, and it's it'll move in and out from that point. Like we said, there's not any real real right way to balance a sword. It's going to be wherever you're going to be. And I know that the Japanese didn't use fullers or bohai is the Japanese term for them for a while until modern. Just like Chinese swords did not use ricassos, which are the blocked shaped portions by the hilt on certain blades. I don't know if I have anything with a ricasso.
Yeah, a lot of the early Japanese swords were basically, like you mentioned, they were clubs. A lot of the original, you'll see them. They're on a lot of the samurai armor, but they're called daitos, and they're very curved. They look almost like a crescent moon, and they've got a very curved handle to them. That's what the style of kendo came from. The swords weren't very sharp, but they were made to kind of beat the opponent's armor in on themselves. So you would hit their armor and dent the armor so that it would actually hit the opponent and cause them not to be able to move their armor as well. As the metallurgy advanced, they actually got sharper swords and they became more of a cutting implement as opposed to a bludgeoning tool.
Yeah, I got here. This is not a real combat sword. This is a Masonic sword, but it does have a ricasso on it, and if you can see it right there, it's this area right here, and that was not found on Chinese swords until late 1800s, early 1900s, until Western swords started being taken in, and then I believe some of the blades got switched and they put the Chinese fittings on them, all that kind of thing. Kind of exchanging. So just like the fullers or whatever, you've got lots of traits that will kind of transfer from culture to culture. One of the things we should probably talk about is what they're made of. Steel. Steel is a wonderful substance, and when we're talking about swords, we're going to be mainly talking about carbon steel. And carbon steel is essentially it's like an iron alloy, or a mix of iron and carbon, which produces these qualities that we have here. Now, there's other alloys that swords are made of. In fact, I believe my dark sword armory long sword here is actually a chromium alloy, a chromium steel rather than a carbon steel, and it's going to have different corrosion properties and everything like that. Carbon steel is generally identified by, I can never remember the acronym, but by the numbers, and they're usually, when you see a 10 and another number, that usually means it's carbon steel. The 10 equals the carbon, and then the whatever equals the percentage of carbon in that particular steel. So 1060 is carbon steel, and I believe it's 0.60%, something like that, of the carbon. Putting more carbon in it, doing all of that, will make it harder, and then, of course, forging it then also can do the same things. So there are lots of different ways different cultures did that thing. Take steel or take iron and make steel out of it. For most of the swords and most tools and stuff like that, you're talking carbon steel, because it's extremely easy. Well, I should say it's relatively easy to make, and you can do it through natural processes, all of that kind of thing. So when we so when we're kind of like looking at all this stuff, the different hardnesses, people kind of talk about the different hardnesses. A soft steel is going to be, obviously is going to bend, not necessarily going to bend back, right? It's not going to, as we say, have a spring to it. When we're talking about, this is pretty modern spring steel, and it's a very, very awesome invention. But it's not modern, but things like Damascus steel, Woods steel, other things allow you to create steel that bends and then returns back to things, even through serious bending. That's not to say that all historicals did that. All historical swords did that. Probably majority of historical swords will bend and stay bent. As I said, this is not a real combat sword, but I don't know if you can still see, it is pretty. It's pretty hooked there. Now it bends to a certain point and bends back, but if you bend it past that point, there, and that's the quality of carbon steel. And so what you can do is the differential heat treatment, which is you have different types of steel mixed in with each other, which can give the blade both qualities, hardness and softness. Probably the most famous example of that is the Japanese version. Jeff, you probably the best qualified to talk about that one.
Yeah, the old traditional samurai swords. Like, if you go back and find one that's hundreds of years old, I would suggest not cutting with it because unless you really, really know what you're doing, if you, like you said, if you cut it and you scoop with it or you do something a little bit wrong with it, you're going to bend it and it's going to be ruined. You can't just take it and pound it back out on an anvil. It's done at that point in time. And just like a paper clip or a Coke can, I mean, something that you bend over and over and over again, it weakens it every time you bend it. My swords are not in any way traditional. They are completely modernized. They actually are impregnated with silicone. So you can bend them a crazy amount and they'll come right back. So they're really good for handing to a beginner and going, here, try this out on a water bottle or a tatami mat, and they're not going to screw your sword up. And as an instructor, I kind of have to have that stuff. Because if I had all traditional swords, I'd never get to own one because they'd all get bent. But yeah, the swords themselves, the old school swords, man, I've done this for almost 20 years, and I don't feel confident cutting with a traditional 800-year-old samurai sword. If somebody handed it to me and said, try this out, I wouldn't want to do that because all it takes is one time and it's ruined. So the old stuff, the Japanese katana gets a lot of really high praise, and people call it like a lightsaber type thing. It's really not. It was very, very unadvanced for all the other metallurgy that was going on around the world at the time. But it was the best thing that they had in that area. And because, like you said, it was a curved weapon, it actually did a lot more damage and did a lot more stuff than a lot of the straight swords did for beginners. So it got this cult following as this really awesome weapon, but really it's not that great of a weapon when you compare it to everything else that was going around at the time.
Yeah, metallurgically, actually, interestingly enough, the Chinese came up with that, the heat treatment kind of thing with the clay on the edge to harden the edge and all of that kind of stuff, and that was imported to Korea and to Japan. But I think it was within 300 years after that, the Chinese completely abandoned that method and went to a Woods, like a Woods type of pattern welding and more things like the Indian and Western swords, so that you had more of that kind of spring going. So that I just always thought. I was surprised when I read that. And joining us, we've got Master Vidnal. Ed, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm sorry for my late entrance.
No problem, no problem. So we're just talking about cutting weapons versus thrusting weapons and kind of balancing. And then we were talking about different types of steel and how kind of old swords and all that kind of stuff, not necessarily spring-rated. As far as they're not going to bend and bounce right back. A lot of them bend and break that kind of thing. So that's kind of where we are right now. So probably the next thing to go into, and we'll get to you, Robert, here on this one, because this is going to be, we get asked a lot, if I want to start getting into swords, what sword should I start with, right? How should I get into it? Now, obviously, our advice is going to, first of all, find a sword school. Find somebody that teaches this stuff. What style? Any style, really. You know, fencing, historical martial, historical European, HEMA, kendo, kung fu, anything that gets your hands on a weapon, gets you kind of moving around, all of that kind of thing is going to be good. And a lot of those places are going to have their own kind of directives on what type of weapon you're allowed to use and what weapon you should have at the beginning. For my part, and I'll just then throw this out here to the panel, the only bit of advice is I'm going to tell all beginners, if this is the first sword that you've ever got, make sure that it is not sharp. Just don't get a sharp sword right off, right? I don't care if you're going to hang it on your wall. I don't care if you're going to, because I guarantee you're going to want to take it out of the scabbard. You're going to want to look at it. You're going to have to clean it, right? We were talking about carbon steel, and one of the things about carbon steel is it actually corrodes, so you have to take care of it. We'll go into kind of how, hopefully, when we have a little bit of time here. But it's just basically oiling the blade, but that means that you have to oil it. When you are handling your sword, you don't want to touch the blade that much because your skin oil is going to be very corrosive to it. All right. When you do touch your blade, if let's say you're getting a practice weapon like one of the fetters over here, and you're doing half sorting and all that kind of thing, just wipe it off with some oil afterward. We can go a little bit more into that, but don't get a sharp blade. There's no reason to have a sharp blade, especially when you're starting out. I know there's all those cutting videos on YouTube and everything like that, but and it's fun, yes, great, but believe me, I've seen people who, I've taken this to sword clubs, taken my katana or something like that, some cutting weapon, and have people who are not used to even, they're very good fencers, but they're not used to handling a weapon that's that heavy, and they cut through it, they can't cut through the bottle, and then the sword kind of flings over here. So just don't get something sharp. That's all I'm going to say, and now I'm going to throw it out to these guys. Why don't we start with Ed and go over to Nero?
Well, my advice, people who are looking for a sword school, if you have options, good for you. I know near me there's one really actually good school that focuses just on swordsmanship, and they do a couple different styles. They have kendo, they have kenjutsu, and they have a couple other Japanese and Korean style sword arts, and they're just a sword art school. Those are hard to find. If you have options, you got to go with the one that you're more excited about. That comes from the teacher and me. If you join a school because you think somebody else looks good at it, and you're not really necessarily excited about learning it for yourself, just being impressed with someone else, you may not put the time and effort in that you really need to put in to benefit the most from the school. So my advice is usually, if you have a choice, go with the thing that you're the most excited to learn, because then you'll actually invest the time, hopefully. And I'm going to echo Chad, which is not surprising. Don't buy a sharp blade. Don't do it. Do not do that. It's a bad plan. I have plenty of dull weapons that are very nice. This is a steel blade katana, but it's dull. It's completely dull. And it's very nice. It's properly weighted. It's got all the right attributes except for the fact that it's not sharp. Do be careful. There are zinc aluminum blades out there that have some strange flexible properties depending upon what style you're learning. Always check with your teacher before you purchase a weapon. They can usually guide you towards the best and most cost-effective thing. But again, for me, it's don't buy anything sharp and go with what makes you happy.
Very good advice. Jared, Nero.
Kind of same aspect about sword schools, most people that I know of, usually have the struggle that they don't have too much around them. They don't have anything. So it's usually, unless you live in a certain area where, I mean, I don't know, by miracle you have a whole plethora of schools that are good and well regarded. Most people, it's like, well, I'm going to go with whatever I can. So, I mean, whatever's reasonable for you, whatever you can afford, that's going to be productive. Yeah, go with that. It's all the same concepts at the core, moving with the weapon and all that kind of stuff. Whatever you like. And I think the most important thing that I wanted to point out in terms of what should I buy for my first sword, just make sure you verify the construction. If you don't know much about, most people don't know much about swords. I've talked to people, and there are swords that are designed to be swung, and there are swords that are not. You can usually tell by the price tag, but not always. And a lot of people, I know of a lot of people who have these swords, and like, this is a really cool sword, and I'm like, no, don't move that. Just put it on a wall, and don't ever touch it, because there's a lot that goes into the construction of a sword. Like Chad was mentioning, the parts of a sword, the blade is supposed to, in a real sword, so that you have leverage and control, and so that the sword has proper structural integrity. The blade goes into what's called a tang, which extends ideally throughout the hilt and into the pommel. This is kind of like the end cap that holds everything together, and the tang extends through, so you're holding it into the blade. It should be all one piece. That's the idea. It varies, tang construction and how that works and how thick they are and everything. It varies a little bit, and you have a little wiggle room there. But there's a lot of swords out there that, especially in the cheap range, that I try to tell people to avoid if they want to swing it around. That have what's called a rat tail tang, and it's basically that a piece of metal is welded onto the actual blade itself. So that is a weak point. And you can unscrew these swords. Actually, I wish I had one for once, because I actually have a couple things that I've actually gotten rid of where I've unscrewed it. And it's just tiny little piece of metal.
Like this right here.
Yeah.
Yes, there you go.
And they're fine if you just want to hang it up on your wall, and some of them look great, and that's cool. That's great. I've had a couple. I still probably have a couple up here, but I definitely recommend looking into how it's constructed. What the tang is like, what the materials are, what the sword's made out of, everything like that. That's all important. And like I said, either look it up, ask someone who knows, so that you don't end up being that guy who's swinging around the sword and then it helicopters off into somebody's face, God forbid.
Yes. Well, here, we'll do a little public service then. I just took apart my Gen here, and this shows you what a real tang is supposed to look like. Okay, you see, here's the blade part. Pull it out there like that. And if you can see that there, this is all one piece. This is just cut out of the blade just a little bit. It's extremely thick. It's got the same blade shape or geometry that the rest of it does. So it's very, very strong. That's what it should look like when you're there. When you see, and Robert, could you hold that up again so that we can see it? And then you can see exactly what that rat tail tang looks like. There you go. So that's just a little piece of metal that's welded onto essentially the square piece of the blade. It doesn't have this structural integrity. And then what you do is you have the hilt pieces, which slide on here. Now my sword is threaded, right? A lot of European swords are peened, which means they have something that's in here and it's just hammered down so you can't really take it apart. some people like that because all you have to do to tighten up the fittings when they loosen up is to rehammer it. I like the nut myself, but it tended to be, and this is not easy when you're talking, but it tends to be that the nut pommels tend to be cheaper, and so people tend to shy away from having that type of construction. I don't mind it. I actually like the convenience of it all, because especially if you are going to be making contact, or even if you're just swinging it around, there's a lot of weight in steel, and it will loosen up your fittings. And it's good to always be able to adjust it back down that way. So that's what an actual tang looks like.
I'll kind of throw out something small for the people who like the katanas. You know, a lot of the like pawn shop katanas you see. I'm sure all you guys have seen the video of the guy who broke it and it stabbed him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's very poor steel, obviously, and he obviously wasn't using it the way it was supposed to. But a lot of these swords will fool you. A lot of the katanas. I'm going to try and get this in the light here. You guys let me know if it's working right. But in order to actually use a katana to cut with, not only does it have to be proper steel, which is carbon steel, not the 440 stainless. If it says 440 stainless on the blade, don't cut with it. That'll break and it can do bad stuff. But you're going to want to look at the handle, and I've got 2 pins in this handle. Now the reason there's 2 pins, the tang goes all the way down, and it'll go all the way down in the cheap katanas too, but they only typically will have 1 pin in them. Now what'll happen is as you cut with that blade, the very cheap wood and the very cheap wrapping that's around the handle of that katana will break, allowing the blade to rotate out of the handle, which usually will come back on your leg or shoot out near somebody. So that's the big danger with the really cheap katanas, is they won't have 2 fittings in them. Now again, this one I told you guys is very non-traditional. So if you can kind of see the shininess of this back one, this back pin, which is where most of the pressure is put on, is actually bronze. So it's not bamboo like traditional. The front one's bamboo. It's just a traditional bamboo pin. But the back one is a bronze one. So it's actually a metal that's a lot stronger than bamboo. So these swords are made for cutting. They're made to be abused and beat on, and they're made to retain their edge for a long time. So they're not very, very traditional as far as Japanese swords go. But always look for the 2 fittings in a Japanese sword. If there's not 2 pins, it's bad news.
Good advice. All right. So Robert, after all of this, do you got any? Do you have any questions or anything that we haven't kind of talked about?
One thing I also want to mention is that swords weren't always just used on foot. I mean, we've got horseback swords. I actually have a cavalry saber here that was given to me as a gift. It's a replica 17th century German cavalry saber. It has a guard only on one side because you didn't need to guard on the inside. You're just coming through with a riding back. It's actually very dull. I'm not sure if they were ever meant to be sharpened, but I know that this one is very dull because that's the way it was built. A simple handguard, but it's very choppy. It's definitely balanced out at 6 inches from the handle. It's designed to just, you're on a horseback and you're just getting out there and you're swinging. Of course, you probably wouldn't decapitate anybody unless you were completely sharp on this, but you wouldn't need to at that speed. You just crush whatever you landed a hit against it. That was the design. But otherwise, no, the questions, I really don't have any. It's been a good learning experience all around otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good point, though, you brought up. Not all swords injuries are going to be cutting. Swords can do serious blunt force trauma. They are steel, right? And they're coming down into an edge. So, like, we have these here, these steel practice swords that are used primarily in HEMA, but I use them for Chinese swordplay in any case, right? Now they're blunt, and the strange blade shape is to kind of replicate them feeling sharp, right? Now, although this is blunt, right, it's still a gigantic bar of steel, and I could probably bury it pretty far in somebody's head if I really hauled off and did it, okay? It just, this stuff is very, very tough. That's why it's used in tools and weapons and all kinds of things. You know, it has been considered a magic type of metal. But yeah, so you know, remember that. And then you've got your hilt, right? So you've got your your crossguard, your pommel, all of this stuff here, which can do all kinds of stuff. In German swordplay, they have the murder strike, where they hold it like this, and they go in and they start bashing somebody in because they're in armor, right? You're not going to cut anybody with it who's wearing armor, right? What you're going to do is you're going to come in, you're going to half sword it, and you're going to kind of pry them out of their armor and try to get them. So that doesn't mean that these weren't sharp. Right. If you see here the schilt, which is this part I kind of mentioned earlier, I believe this is kind of replicating a little bit about where that edge is supposed to be. But from what I understand, most European swords are sharpened, historical ones are sharpened all the way down to the hilt. This doesn't mean they're razor sharp all the way down. Probably, as you were saying, right up here is where you're going to get most of your thing. We call it the center of percussion. And if you have a spring-rated sword and you do that, I don't know if you can see it. If I kind of do it like this, and you see it, there'll be a point that is kind of steady, right? And it's right about here. This is the point of percussion where there's going to be all the shock is going to be coming into and from this point. So if I can make contact with that spot in the weapon, oh, great news, because that's the most I can get out of this tool right here. And so yeah, there's a lot of things that, like you said, parrying on the flat. It's not. You don't always have to do it, and obviously there's going to be edge-to-edge contact in the chaos of battle and everything like that, but you can very easily, move so that you're receiving blows on the flat, unless you're doing specific things like filing down, or, there's all kinds of things that you can do. Yeah, so just because we're talking cut and thrust doesn't mean it can only cut and thrust. That would be a little point I probably wanted to drive home there. Okay. So, anything else, gentlemen? Anything else to add here? No? Well, we've got a lot of... we're doing this here because we're going to be moving. We're going to do some stuff on the conventional weapons, on the swords. Obviously, they have fantasy value for all kinds of things like Game of Thrones and Dungeons and Dragons, all that kind of stuff. But even in Star Wars, right? We got vibro blades, and there's lots of people who aren't Jedi, right? All that kind of thing. So, so hopefully we'll be seeing more of these guys, and hopefully we'll be seeing more of you all out there picking stuff like this up. So there you go. To summarize, if you're out there looking for a sword, find some place to learn, right? Some place that you can learn from in person. Don't get a sharp weapon. Make sure that it's well constructed, and you can go to places. Maybe we'll just put these out here. I'll just go through you guys. There are places that you can go which are reputable, and I'll just throw out my favorite place right now. I'll throw out two of them. Purple Heart Armory for practice weapons, which are not necessarily cutting weapons and meat weapons, but they're like wooden weapons. They sell these there, and then plastic, all that kind of stuff. Great starters for weapons. They're very, very good, very safe. And Cult of Athena for replica weapons and all that kind of stuff. We'll put these links in there. Anybody else here got places they'd go or places they'd recommend for looking at swords or this kind of stuff?
One of the places I like that's just a general knowledge base is, excuse me, it's the Sword Buyer's Guide. I think it's sbg.com, something like that. But they do everything from Japanese to Chinese to long swords. The guy admits that he's a backyard cutter, which I'm not a big fan of, which means he's not very well trained, but he cuts bottles in his backyard. But they do some legitimate tests, and they actually put some of these weapons to a test to show you what they can put up with and what they can. That's a good site. And as far as Japanese swords, the ones that I've got, I really enjoy. They're from chinescutlery.com, CHENESS. And they actually come blunted or sharpened, so you can get either one. So they're the same exact sword, they just don't have an edge on them. So those are the two sites I like for swords.
Yeah, Sword Buyer guys. The thing about the cutting, I actually really prefer that he doesn't have any skill or any training, because it actually puts the impetus on the weapon, right? The real test of a weapon is hand it to a noob, and if they can destroy it, then maybe you don't want to use it. But if so and remember, sword makers, when they would test it, they weren't necessarily trained in sword play. They were really good at making swords, and they would go, So I actually like Sword Buyer's Guide a lot, and I reference them a lot. So that's definitely a good thing. Anyone else have anything to add or places?
You mentioned pretty much all my favorite sources, so I'm pretty much out there. But there are a couple different brands, and they tend to vary. And the problem is, you have to nail down a price that you can afford. Obviously starting out, nobody wants to put a lot of money into something that they're not sure about. One among a few, in terms of companies that make pretty affordable swords. They actually made this thing. I have a number of theirs. Hanwei. Cost Hanwei, they make a lot of varied swords in a sort of a moderate price range. They're all like 150 to 250, something like that. They're all well constructed swords, nothing crazy over the top that you're going to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on. But they make everything from this is sharp, and like we said, no sharp swords to start. But they make this is their one of their practical line. It's another one of the training weapons like they use in HEMA, blunted tip and everything, and they make good stuff. I have a lot of their things, and they're all great, and they're nice.
I like Hanwei too. This is a Hanwei here. I've got a few other ones as well. So yeah, Hanwei. I do enjoy them. They're a very good mid-range company.
I've got the old version of that one.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, with the bigger pump. Yeah, they're also, they're mostly I get them off of like Cult of Athena. Every once in a while they won't have something, but Cult of Athena generally has Hanwei and those sort of brands at the lowest prices that I've seen. There have been a lot of swords I've been looking at, and I'll research and I'll check other sources, and for some reason Cult of Athena has just very, very low prices and good selection. So
absolutely, yeah, I highly recommend them. All right. Well, that is bringing us here to the end of our hour. Thank you to all our panel. Thank you to you for tuning in. We've had a great time talking about our favorite thing, one of our favorite things, swords here. Hopefully we'll be talking about it more in the future. You're gonna see some more spots. I know we haven't been so active of late, but we've got stuff in the works coming down the pipe, as it were, and some big changes coming up in April. So stay tuned. Until then, have a great weekend. May the Force be with you, and happy sabering.